Hey guys, and welcome back to another Lost Bits video right here on TetraBitGaming, the series where we explore the unused, altered, and unseen content in gaming. So recently, I covered the Plants vs. Zombies series for the first time on my channel, and you guys absolutely blew it up with likes and comments. That to say most of you enjoyed seeing it would likely be an understatement. And as a result, we are back again today, checking out the game that started it all, but this time taking a deeper dive into more changes seen in some pre-release builds of the game, as well as a few more things found kicking around unused in the final release. And before we jump in, gotta give a quick shout out to both G Fuel and Control for supporting the channel. If you'd like to try some delicious energy formula or healthy meal replacements, check them out and be sure to use code TETRA at checkout for some extra savings. And with all of that said, tap the like button below to collect some sun. Let's check out some more Plants vs. Zombies Lost Bits. Alright, so let's start off this video with all the pre-release stuff. And before we even get to some of the beta builds, first, there are several bits of concept art for the game that reveal a lot of zombies, plants, and ideas that never made the cut for the final release. For starters, there are a few concept sketches for potential enemies for the game. In addition to Sylvester, the alien seen in another game made by the developers of Plants vs. Zombies, Insane Aquarium, here there are several other concepts for the enemies. And I guess this was a time before even zombies were chosen as the main antagonists, as here we can see various other things like some grasshoppers, drill bots or something, some kind of flying demon bat thing, a weird multi-eyed crocodile, a bipedal demon, and more. Then for the plant side of things, there too among the concept sketches are various types of plants that never made the cut, at least in this game. These include more vegetables like carrots, an onion, and a radish. Then there's also dandelions, this plant with 4 leaves, as well as whatever this thing is. Then additionally here, we can also see some alternate designs of plants that we did see in the game, like this simplistic flytrap, this jalapeno that has it growing a stem off of the ground, a sad-looking pumpkin fella, as well as this, what I think is the coffee bean, seen here like it's ready for war. And we went over this briefly in my previous video, but this concept art here also shows a few early sketches of the pea shooter back when it looked more like a pea pod. And here it also looks like maybe even each of the individual peas that were shot out were considered to have a face too. Then next we got another really early conceptual sketch here, as it appears to be planning out how the game was going to look and play. Here we too can see some more ideas that were cut from the game, including a 2-player mode where the second player would send aliens down, at least I think that's what it says. Unfortunately, the resolution of these images, as you can see, often aren't ideal. And yeah, I guess the antagonists were planned to be aliens instead of zombies at this point, as even though there's an early design sketch of a zombie-looking fella here, alien types are listed here, and these also contain at least one mechanic that wasn't ever implemented in this game, a fire-type enemy that would have been neutralized with water. There's also a jumping and double jumping enemy listed here, and the jumper might have been turned into the pole vaulting zombie, but I'm not really sure how the double jumping was intended to work. And lastly here, we can see yet another seemingly scrapped plant type in what looks to be a turnip that would apparently generate money for the player, so I guess this was later replaced with the marigold flowers in the game. Another interesting concept art is for the Zombot final boss of the game. This sketch appears to show that initially, instead of just Zomboss controlling the Zombot, the idea was that yet another character would be controlling Zomboss, who would in turn then control the Zombot. Pretty trippy. And lastly, for the concept art, in addition to showing off some earlier concept sketches of many of the game's plants, the game's artist, Rich Werner, had also shared some more conceptual sketches of the game's zombies, including many variants that didn't make it into the game. These include a zombie in a dress, a painter zombie, a zombie in a leather jacket, little boy and girl zombies. There's a zombie in a hoodie, an alternate Jack-in-the-Box zombie complete with a little monkey zombie too, a thick zombie, a Jimbro zombie that would apparently use a whole flippin' power line pole, presumably as an attack, and there's also a pole-less earlier design for him too. Then there's also art for the unused dog zombie that I covered in my previous video, a zombie with a rolling pin, Yet another scrap design for the Jack-in-the-Box zombie, this time a clown, construction worker zombies, and finally an I don't even know how to explain this zombie. Now I think some of these zombie designs are pretty cool, and even if some of them didn't behave any differently than the standard zombies, the variety in designs would have been really nice to see and would have added some more charm to this game. Then for zombies that didn't go unused, in these concept sketches we can also see some early designs for the standard brown coat zombie, as well as a Zomboni-less and Toque-less Zomboni zombie that normally is never seen in full like this. Next up, although not left over in the game or anything, the composer for Plants vs. Zombies, Laura Shigihara, has posted several early versions of songs heard in the game, as well as one track that was completely scrapped. For the most part, the differences are pretty minimal, ranging from different levels of reverb, to the early versions lacking a proper looping section, causing them to abruptly get cut out. Other more notable changes include the cerebral track being initially a whole octave lower compared to how it's heard in the final, an early version of the Ultimate Battle track has a normally unheard 4-note ending that I guess was cut since the song always loops in the game. And then for the Graze the Roof song, in the early version a piano was used as the main instrument instead of a plucked string instrument as is heard in the final version. The rest of the differences between the tracks are frankly not so interesting in my opinion, so we'll skip over them here. But if you are interested in listening to them all in full, head on over to the cutting room floor linked down in the description below. And now lastly for the audio stuff, like I mentioned, there's one track that never made it to the final cut of the game. And this is a track simply known as Zombotany, I guess named after one of the many scrapped titles that were tossed around for this game before Plants vs. Zombies was chosen, as discussed in my previous video. Anyways, here's a quick sample of the track. Now apparently, according to Laura Shigihara, this unused track was intended for the final boss fight, but since the more intense sections of the song weren't long enough for the boss battle, the song was outright scrapped in favor of Brainiac Maniac as is heard in the final release. Now next up, I want to briefly touch on a presentation of the game that was given that showcased several early prototype builds of the game, and of course here there are several changes that can be seen compared to the final version. For starters, a prototype from July 2006 was showcased, a whole 3 years before the game was released. This build has an incredibly early title screen, a really basic main menu with a stock photo of a bunch of zombies, as well as the early leaf background graphic plant selection screen that I mentioned in my previous video. Interestingly, this build would have featured a very different mechanic for the plants than how they work in the final game. Instead of just picking a bunch of plants you want and being able to place as many of each with the only constraint being your sun count, you would have instead picked a deck of cards that would be assigned a probability value in order to be drawn in the game. So as shown here, after drawing 3 random cards at the start, the next plant that would show up would be randomly chosen based on the rest of the cards that you chose in your deck. It's a bit confusing, so I'm glad that this was scrapped in favor of being able to just place any plant whenever, as long as you have enough sun. Also, as you probably noticed here, this build of the game still features some early placeholder graphics and doesn't even have the lawnmowers as the last line of defense, but instead just some caution bars. And these were also seen in another early animation posted by the game's developer, George Fan, where there can be seen that as a placeholder, if the zombies reached one of these bars, they would just get blammoed out of existence. Then also in this same presentation, after showing off a whole bunch of other prototype builds that aren't currently publicly available, a build from April 1st, 2008 is shown off back when the game's name was changed to Lawn of the Dead. Here on the main menu, an early graphic for the adventure mode was seen, as well as only 2 other missing options on the tombstone instead of the total of 4 that's seen in future builds. Then when going to the adventure mode in this particular build, it would lead to an otherwise unseen snow level where a bunch of zombies are seen frozen in place in front of a stock image of some frozen tundra. April 1st is of course April Fool's Day, so the developers played a little prank with this build, as in this prototype the zombies don't ever move and no sunlight could ever be collected, leaving you basically stuck on this screen with nothing to do. And now let's switch gears and finally talk about some of the pre-release builds of Plants vs. Zombies that are actually publicly available, as they've been acquired from 2 former beta testers of the game and then subsequently dumped online for the world to enjoy. The first of these prototypes is version 0.1.1.1014 that was built in December of 2008, around 5 months prior to the game's final release. Right off the bat, interestingly, despite being so close to the final release date, this build still carries the early Bloom and Doom name, suggesting that the final decision to go with Plants vs. Zombies might have been a pretty last-minute call. Now there are a whole bunch of changes seen in this early build, from placeholder text for Crazy Dave, to this build lacking several sound effects, to an early animation for the Jack-in-the-Box zombie. There's no opening or ending cinematic implemented here yet. There are some graphical changes, like with the reward animation graphic appearing darker here. The Zombies Ate Your Brains graphic seen when failing a level is stylized a bit differently, and Crazy Dave lacks a mallet graphic for the mallet minigame, and here refers to it as a hammer instead. A number of things are different in the menus too. For starters, on the minigames menu, some of the thumbnail graphics are different. A trophy is placed right over the graphic here when completing a puzzle or minigame, instead of the red corner banner that's seen in the final. The Walnut Bowling and the Gould minigames swapped places. And then on the main menu, the help button leads to a simple placeholder pop-up window telling the player to check back later, as opposed to the full-screen handwritten zombie note. This prototype also has an early credit sequence that's thought to be an early version of the Zombies on Your Lawn music video that's seen in the final game's ending sequence. There are a plethora of more minor changes in each individual level, some text strings, and in the almanacs. So many so that, once again, in the interest of time, I won't go into more detail for them in this video, but again, if you're interested, I'll kindly direct you to the cutting room floor page down below. That said though, there's actually an unused level 6 in this build that can only be accessed via a level select that can be enabled by using some debug functions. This stage obviously wasn't ready for release, as we can see it still utilizes some very early placeholder graphics, but it also appears to show a level design that was scrapped or perhaps reworked into the rooftop mechanic. Now, despite not having a pool here, this level 6 appears to have been meant to take place in the backyard area, and it would have had this elevated 4x5 section in the top right here. And much like the rooftop stages, most plants can't shoot up to this elevated portion, thus requiring one of the catapult plants or a plant placed up there. So yeah, I guess this might have been the original idea for the elevation mechanic that was reworked for the rooftop stages. Now back to some more audio changes. This early build uses at least 2 different sound effects that are notable compared to the final version. The first of these is the sound effect for breaking open a vase in the vase minigame. And then the second difference can be heard with the sound effect for the slot machine minigame, where in this prototype the quality of the audio file sounds much lower. Then moving on, we have the second and only other currently publicly dumped prototype of Plants vs. Zombies, version 0.9.9.1029. Being so close to version 1.0 and built in February of 2009, only around 3 months before the full release of the game, it shouldn't come as a surprise that this prototype is much closer to the final product. For starters here, this build ditches the Bloom and Doom name for Plants vs. Zombies instead. That said, however, as you can see here, the logo appears quite different than the final design. The font is different, as is the gravestone, and the old logo design had all of this grass and soil under the text, which was almost completely removed in the final design, except for under the tombstone. And unfortunately, that's pretty much where the changes end, as for the most part, almost everything else is basically the same as the final release. One last notable difference I want to go over here is that this prototype, a different credits end screen can be seen. There are several question mark names in the QA tester and special thanks sections. Chad here was removed from the QA tester credits, RIP Chad, and I guess this person was upgraded from the special thanks section all the way to studio director, which honestly seems like a pretty big jump. And now, last up for this video, I want to go over a secret menu in the game that goes normally unused, but can actually be re-implemented into the game with some modifications. And yeah, it's not only found in the pre-release builds, but even in the final release too. So hidden in the menu that you normally see when going to survival or puzzles or minigames, there is a page simply listed as Limbo Page. And this Limbo Page actually lets you access several hidden features and even some unused minigames, so let's go over them all here. First up, we got the Walnut Art Challenge, and just like the other art challenges in the game, the idea here is to place walnuts on the lawn to make the shape of a bigger nut. Interestingly though, exclusive to the prototype build, this otherwise inaccessible minigame also contains 2 large eye graphics that when completing the challenge would result in the design looking much more akin to the walnut. And despite these graphics being removed from the version found in the final game, I guess their properties weren't fully removed, as you still can't place any plants on the tiles that they would have occupied, and I guess this actually explains a lot. I was super confused why I couldn't plant anything in those spots when I first played this minigame. Then next up on the Limbo Page is Sunny Day, and as the name suggests, things are much sunnier. The zombies encroach as normal, but here, larger sun things will fall, giving you 50 instead of the normal 25 you usually get. This certainly makes it easier to set up your army of plants, but I guess it isn't all too interesting of a minigame, which could have been why it wasn't fully implemented. Then next we got Unsodded, which is honestly a pretty neat minigame. Here only the middle 3 rows have tiles that you can place plants on, but unlike the earlier levels in the game's adventure mode, the zombies will actually still walk on the top and bottom paths. So you'll have to use plants and shrooms that fire vertically, at an angle, or the 3 Peters to beat this one. Up next is Big Time, and here, you guessed it, some units are big. Unfortunately, however, although any plants can be selected and used, only the marigolds, sunflowers, and walnuts actually have their size increased here. Based on this, I'm guessing the idea to scrap this minigame was made earlier before any more plants had their size increased. It's kind of a cool novelty, but I guess just like the Sunny Day minigame, after playing through it once, it might not have been deemed interesting enough to keep. Next, there's Art Challenge Sunflower, which again is just another art challenge stage, this time with making a sunflower design. And then there's Air Raid, which is a fog level with mostly balloon zombies attacking you. Honestly, I thought this challenge would be pretty easy, but since cacti are so expensive, it was pretty challenging to get set up on this one. Now interestingly, next up is a minigame listed as Ice Level, and apparently this was meant to be the ice level that was used as the joke for the April Fool's build we went over earlier. Unfortunately though, due to most of the ice level assets being removed, the end resulting leftover here is just a default daytime stage without any zombies even. And no sun ever drops either, so after you're done planting the 1 walnut with the default 50 sun you're given, you're pretty much stuck here with nothing else to do. The next option on the menu is Zen Garden, and I assume at some point it was just going to take you to the Zen Garden part of the game, but here it just crashes for me. Then moving on, next is High Gravity, which ramps up the gravity on a rooftop stage, basically making most catapult plants and the starfruit useless, making this quite the challenge. Grave Danger is a pretty normal nighttime map with just some more gravestones in the backyard. Then there's a different Can You Dig It here that's not the same as the one iZombie level. Here the idea is that the player's lawn is covered in walnuts and the player has to use the shovel to strategically dig out some nuts and replace them with pea shooters. Basically, I guess this minigame boils down to balancing how many of these nuts you'd like to keep around for defense and how much room you want to make for offense. Next is Dark Stormy Night, which is basically just a more difficult level 4-10 from adventure mode. Then similarly, there's Bungie Blitz, which has this also otherwise unused thumbnail graphic that's just a more difficult version of adventure mode's 5-5. Then we got a bunch of survival endless levels, which, as their name suggests, are just endless versions of each respective zone in the game aside from the backyard pool level. These are very similar to the survival levels that are seen in the game, but are of course endless as opposed to having a limit of flags. Then we got Upsell, which is basically what the developers use to upsell a player who is playing the demo version of this game to purchase the full game after completing level 3-4. Then the Tree of Wisdom option here just takes you to the Tree of Wisdom, go figure. Now lastly, interestingly, there's one more minigame on this Limbo page that isn't easily accessible in the final game, but is more readily seen in the first prototype build we went over earlier, since in the final version, the intro minigame covers it on this page. And as it suggests, the intro selection here just takes you to the start of the adventure mode as if you were playing it for the first time. But yeah, in the prototype build, the squirrel option is uncovered, so let's check it out. Now this minigame starts off very similar to Can You Dig It, as the screen is filled with walnuts. But this time, instead of digging to plant pea shooters, you dig out the nuts in order to find some hiding squirrels. Unfortunately, these squirrels aren't visible in the final release of the game, even if you do manage to load into this minigame. But they can be seen in the prototype builds, and yeah, these squirrel fellas aren't ever seen anywhere else in Plants vs. Zombies. Sorry, chumbos. Anyways, yeah, those are all of the unused minigames that can be found in this hidden page in the game. They do differ in terms of quality in my opinion, so I think it's no surprise why some of them were cut, but some, like the Endless Wave ones, I think could have been really cool to see. I guess at least they're still found left over for us in the game to enjoy if we really want to. And my friends, I think we'll leave it there for this video. We're not quite done with the prototypes just yet, as there are a whole bunch more graphics that went unused, but we'll save that for a future video, so stay tuned for that. You guys have absolutely shown interest in the series on my channel, so as long as you keep blowing up these videos with your amazing support, you can expect more Plants vs. Zombies videos in the future. Anyways, while you're here, check out some of my other Lost Bits, and be sure to subscribe to find your way back here in the future. And as always, thank you all so much for stopping by today, and I will see you in a bit.